Ladies and gentlemen, let us discuss the Xbox One's hardware. Phil Spencer has just given an interview where he's discussed a lot of the specifics of the Xbox One and how he feels that the system stacks up against Sony's PlayStation 4. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of the various controversies surrounding the Xbox One's, not only the resolution but the frame rate. Several titles, for example Call of Duty Ghosts and Battlefield 4, are running at a lower resolution on the Xbox One compared to the PlayStation 4. Also, there was a literal shitstorm when Rise Son of Rome had a slightly lower resolution announced, and of course, the polygon models were reduced in quality. They were roughly halved, but of course this was to make room for better shaders and so on. Meanwhile, Forza, of course, does run at 1080p, 60 frames per second, which Microsoft are very proud of. So, let's go into the interview itself. He begins by saying the Xbox One architecture is much more complex than any specific feature or component. The proof is ultimately in the games and what gamers see and experience with the diversity and quality of the games we have at launch. Games like Rise, Son of Rome, and Forza Motorsport 5, we are delivering experiences that demonstrate the power capable only on the Xbox One. This is only the beginning. As creators spend more time with our development tools and tap into the power of the cloud compute, we're confident that Xbox One will be the home of the best games, now and for years to come. He also added, in the design process of a game, any game, you're thinking about fidelity of input, how responsive input is, which is really a frame rate question, obviously more than a frame size question. If you think about a fighting game or you think about a racing game, 60 FPS for your precious games is something you're going to target. Out of quote for a second, why can't someone tell the developers for Need for Speed that 60 versus 30, you see how that works? Anyway, going back into it before I continue on to a rant, 60 FPS per second for precision games is something you're going to target, which is obviously going to have some impact on the resolution and density of a scene that you're going to build because you're flipping frames twice as quickly. The other thing is that you have real high contrast outdoor environments with a lot of foliage and other things, and you start at strong lighting and anti-aliasing techniques that you can want to put into place, which again is a trade-off against frame rate and scene density and scene resolution. To me, it's always about putting the controls in the hands of the creators and the developers and the visual artists to pull the right levers and I think it's a right experience for gameplay and visuals to try and blend and turn it into a math exercise of if it's not this frame rate or not this resolution, then somehow it's not a valid game or it's less of a game. I think that's an issue. We actually ran the game at 720p, 900p, and 1080p. This, by the way, is Rise Son of Rome, and all with different lighting techniques, and all at 30 said, you know what, we think this game looks best with everything we're able to turn on. 900p is where the game landed. It didn't look better given all the techniques, given the techniques we were going to employ. We don't really entertain anything below 30 frames per second. We see that as a bug and something that needs to be fixed. Things like screen tearing, I think, are bugs. When the frame rate is out, I think those kind of anomalies break the immersion for people. The nice thing about playing games with the great visuals is you kind of lose yourself in the scene. And when things that happen are out anomalous to that, I think it pulls people out. So we're always looking to stomp those out. There's a lot more, by the way, on Kotaku. So what are my thoughts on this? Because obviously a lot has been said, regarding the Xbox One and the specifications. Well, first of all, let's talk about frame rate and let's talk about resolution. Here's the bottom line, in my personal opinion. Certain games, they just don't work at low frames per second. It's as simple as that. We can dress it up. We can speak about it all day long. Some games just don't work because they just have too much latency, specifically milliseconds of latency. So 30 milliseconds of 30 frames per second has double the latency per frame as say 60 and so on. Now, certain games it doesn't matter quite so much, but if you're playing like a Twitch-based shooter, in my personal opinion, it starts to really, well, stack up. Now, of course, the bottom line is, Microsoft can tell us all day long that the resolution, has been selected that's best for the title that's running, and of course it is down to the game's developers. I completely hold my hand up, I agree. Because if there was no finite limits on power, even PCs wouldn't be able to keep up, and PCs are substantially more powerful than next-gen consoles. That's just the bottom line. If, for example, games developers really wanted, they could optimize for like 10 T-flops of computing power, which would be like, say, 2 Radeon 290Xs in Crossfire, or 2, say, GTX 780 Ti's in SLI, which would be something like, over 10 T-flops of computing power. And actually, you could have more than that, should you so desire. You could actually have tri-SLI or tri-Crossfire, but then you're getting into the realms of just ludicrous performance. And then, of course, you could be targeting something like 120 frames per second at crazy resolutions. But let's face it, you can't, aim at PC games at that, because 98% of the market simply would not even be able to afford that. So what you do is you go for a pretty high-end up blend. Average GPU on a PC, still going to be better typically than a console. Same thing with, say, the PlayStation 4. Sure, it does have, a more powerful GPU. Yes, it does have more memory bandwidth, but, and that's the key word, there are still finite limits on its power. The problem isn't that, developers are saying that, well, it's going to be 720p, or, 900p, or that, they're choosing a frame rate, because that's all acceptable, right? Everyone knows that a title that's 720p at 30 frames per second, you can have technically more stuff on screen than you can 1080p 60. It's pretty simple. A lot of the titles on the PlayStation 4 that are running at 1080p 60 are indie titles. And of course, if you get a game like, say, Trine 2, sure, it's good it's running at 60 frames per second on the PS4. I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing it's good that it's running at 1080p. But ultimately, I would have been shocked if the game hadn't ran at 1080p at 60 frames per second. I mean, come on, it's, like a £350 console. And we're talking about a game which has, let me check out the specifications. Okay, minimum system requirements are 2 GHz dual-core processor, 1 GB of RAM, 2.5 GB of hard drive, and a low-end graphics card. We're talking like a HD 2400 Radeon or a GeForce 7600. Those are several years old. So even if you say the recommended system requirements, it's nothing compared to a modern PC. My point being, of course, it's going to run it. Now, once again, I'm not taking anything away from the PlayStation 4, but I'm just trying to put some things into perspective. But where people are starting to crucify Microsoft isn't the people... obviously you're going to get people who don't understand what graphics are like, but I think those who understand technology, they're not concerned and saying, well, we expect every game to be 1080p at 60 frames per second. But I think where people are coming from this isn't that. I think they're coming from the point of, look, a lot of your ports are lower resolution or lower frame rate than the PS4, and so look, if I'm going to buy a machine, let's just put this in a very neutral black and white perspective. If I'm going to buy a machine, and I don't really know which games are going to be best on the future in terms of exclusives, do I, right now? Sure, I could say look at Infamous, and I can look at the title like Titanfall, and I can look at other games and I can say, okay, I could make an educated guess, but that's all it would be. I can't tell you what, say, 2 years down the line is going to look at in terms of exclusives, but I do know that the titles that are going to be on the PS4 are definitely going to look better than the Xbox One, unless something changes, and I think that's where people are having some difficulty. At the same time, I do think that there's also got to be a level of give and take here. It's like, sure, I understand that the PlayStation 4 is, quite powerful and everything like that, but I also think that there's got to be a level of expectation, because if people expect, the PS4 to be 1080p or whatever in, say, 2 years' time, but all the games, they're just going to have a bad time of it, because that's not really acceptable either. Bottom line is, both machines right now, they're very early. We know the Xbox One has some issues regarding the ESRAM. We know that they're going to have to work around it, because as far as my understanding goes in regards to the ESRAM, sure, they can use tiled resources, right? Which I'm sure most of you are aware, it's basically like a virtual texturing system. So effectively, let's say you allocate 16 megabytes to tiled resources. Technically, you could have a huge pool of, textures, like 10, 15, 20 gigs, whatever. But the problem is, it doesn't work with everything, for A, and for B, it's also still not going to fix things like frame buffer. Third thing, developers have to actually A, get used to it, and B, be willing to use it, which is a huge issue. I honestly think, here's the thing, the memory bandwidth of the ESRAM is like just over 200 gigabytes per second, 204. My personal opinion with that is that the memory bandwidth of the ESRAM is actually going to not be too much of a big deal. I think it's going to be plentiful. I think it's going to be bountiful. What I actually think is going to be the most important memory bandwidth is going to be the DDR3, because that's where the majority of your resources are going to be. Therefore, I think a lot of the time you're going to be needing to optimize the use of the memory bandwidth for the DDR3. And instead, I think with the ESRAM, you're going to be getting situations where you've got to actually, instead of worry about the memory bandwidth for the ESRAM, I think you're going to have to actually concern yourself more with what you're actually filling the ESRAM with. So to clarify, I think it's going to be a case of not the speed of the ESRAM that's causing the problem. I think it's going to actually be the amount of memory, which is 32 megabytes. So once again, I don't think that the Xbox One is going to be unworkable. I don't think you're going to get this situation where the Xbox One graphics are like, this horrible slideshow, and the PlayStation 4 is going to be like this magical nirvana, because that just doesn't make sense. On the same hand, though, I do think for developers it's going to be more challenging working with the system in regarding the ESRAM, and I do think the GPU is going to be a problem. At the same time, though, a lot of these things eventually were going to become a problem with the PlayStation 4 in terms of the resolution and the frame rate. And as gamers, we might not want to accept that, we may not like that, but there you have it. As I've said, personally speaking, I love PC gaming, and I might sound a bit of a broken record, I might sound like a fan, but that's just my personal opinion, and that's all we can ever go with. I love PC gaming. I love the fact that I can crank it all the way up to 1080p or higher. I love the fact that technically I could get 120 hertz. I could get 220 or 320 hertz monitors with a ridiculously powerful setup. If I had the cash, I could do so. And you could have absolute ludicrous resolutions with PC. And to be honest with you, even gaming at 1080p isn't that difficult for most modern GPUs. It really isn't. I mean, sure, if you start to crank up the anti-aliasing, then you start getting problems. But for consoles, I don't think like that a lot of the time. Sure, it is good to have better looking visuals, but a lot of the time it's all about the games. The Xbox One is looking quite strong in terms of the games. I will say that there are a couple of titles on it right now that I wish I could be playing. For example, Killer Instinct. I'm a pretty big fighting game fan. Rise, Son of Rome looks quite nice. There are a couple of others as well. But I'm just going to get the system, is basically all there is to it. I pre-ordered it. Haven't been able to get hold of it, so, QQ River and all. But bottom line, I think it's all going to be about the games. We're just going to have to see how the story unfolds. But I've spoken about this for far too long now for today. I think you're getting the message. I guess all we can see is just how the story unfolds. Regardless, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.